Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome today to the Q Primary Care webinar. My name is Ramya Matthew, and I'm the convener for the Q Primary Care group. And we're very lucky to have Dr. William Bostock with us today. Will is a GP in Cambridgeshire, and he's been exploring using podcasts to enhance and extend the GP consultation. I think, like many of us, Will has struggled sometimes with the concept of the 10-minute GP consultation and has felt that it hasn't really addressed the underlying problems as to why people present to us in general practice for things like back pain or depression or obesity. And he's been exploring the use of podcasts to try and address some of these problems. So this session, I think, is going to be much more about Will's personal journey of trying something new and innovating. So I think some of the previous sessions have focused much more on QI tools, but this is more about Will's personal journey. So really looking forward to hearing about that. I'm going to hand over to Will now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ramya. So I'm going to share my screen if we can. Okay, is that working?
Yep.
Fantastic. So first of all, I want to thank Ramya for organising these sessions and for inviting me along to speak with you. As she says, my name is Will Bostock, and I'm a GP in Cambridge. I'm currently working as a locum. And since I qualified in May 2019, I've been producing a podcast called Cambridge Progressive Medicine, which I've been regularly using as a consulting tool during my routine consults. And I'd like to share with you today a little bit about what it's all about, and hopefully to get a discussion going about the benefits and also the potential pitfalls of such an approach. It's certainly a work in progress for me, and it'd be great to get some perspective from other members of the Q community and to think about how this work can be taken forwards. So I want to start off with a little bit of backstory. Now, I've never normally been a fan of the about me part of presentations, but I think it helps to understand what Cambridge Progressive Medicine is all about. Like many people, my path into general practice was somewhat convoluted. I actually did a philosophy degree before medical school. And then when I qualified, I did core medical training and the MRCP before going to work in emergency medicine. And I worked in New Zealand and then later on in cruise ships. And as doctors, we tend to very much define our identities by our career choices. And I definitely saw myself as an A&E doctor, and I fully embraced the cynical attitude that often entails. And although it's not what I said in my entrance interview, I really went into general practice because the training was short. When I came back to the UK in 2015, it became apparent that the previous training I'd done wasn't going to be recognised. And if I wanted to carry on with an emergency medicine career, I'd have to go right back to the beginning. But in the meantime, I'd got married, I'd bought my first house, and I was planning on starting a family. I'd kind of had enough of being a junior doctor, and I felt I'd done my fair share of working at 3 AM on Christmas Day. And although I thought I'd miss A&E, which incidentally I really don't, it didn't really seem worth it anymore. But of course, I still had a mortgage to pay, and so general practice with a 3-year training program was just too tempting to resist. As interesting as my life story is to me, I realise that it's not the reason you gave up your lunchtime today. But I think it is relevant because where we've come from helps us to understand where we end up. When I started my GP training, I had very fixed ideas about what the roles of the doctor and the patient were and what it meant to be healthy. For me, not being healthy meant that your shoulder was dislocated. You'd come to see me in agony, and I'd give you some morphine and some midazolam and put it back in place, thus restoring you back to health. In my first year of GP training, I remember my educational supervisor commenting on a reflection I'd written, asking if I'd considered the patient's ice. And I had no idea what she was talking about. I had to go away and look it up. And when I did, it didn't strike me as very important. Obviously, the patient's idea was that they were sick. The concern was that they were going to die. And the expectation was that I would do something about it. And in an A&E setting, this kind of makes some sense. When a patient presents with palpitations and dizziness, and you're confronted with this ECG, the patient's ideas about why they might be feeling unwell don't seem to be that relevant. It tends to make you adopt a rather doctor-centered approach to the proceedings. You tell the patient what's wrong and what you're going to do about it. Now, I wasn't completely heartless. Like, I did always warn them that what I was about to do would make them feel like they're about to die. Giving adenosine for SVT and putting dislocated shoulders back in is pretty satisfying stuff. And in some ways, it's where Western medicine really shines, because these are genuine quick fixes, at least as far as the ED physician is concerned. And who among us doesn't love a quick fix? So when I applied for GP training, I really thought that GP was just A&E in the community. And for the briefest of moments, that seemed to be working. On my first day in practice, I diagnosed someone with fast AF and tinkered around with some antihypertensives and sutured up a scalp wound. And I really thought it was all going to be a breeze. But then I started to see patients with palpitations and dizziness, and they had this ECG. And then I saw people with shoulder pain, and this was their shoulder X-ray. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that I've never seen a normal ECG or X-ray before. Sick patients in A&E are the exception and not the rule. It's just we had an excellent management plan for all the troponin negative chest pain, paracetamol overdoses below the treatment line, and complex social issues. But the problem was, now I was the GP, and all those patients I sent into A&E from general practice with chest pain and breathlessness and thunderclap headaches came back to see me the next week, because even though A&E had told them everything was okay, their symptoms hadn't gone away. So suddenly A&E in the community didn't seem to be working out, because I'd run out of management plans. I had no use for adenosine anymore, but there didn't seem to be anything in my medical toolkit with which to replace it. What's more, people started to come and see me with problems that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with the stuff I'd learned at medical school, and which I had no idea how to treat. Now, it might seem shocking to some of you that by this time I've been practicing medicine for quite some time, but I had absolutely no idea that healthy 30-year-olds would come and consult a doctor because they were feeling tired at work. I thought feeling tired at work was normal, and I assumed that everyone else did too. I remember eagerly asking what seemed to be the problem, and then being completely stumped and having absolutely no idea what to say next. I also distinctly remember my first consult for an epigastric mass that turned out to be a xiphisternum. Initially, I was mildly amused and glad to be able to reassure the patient that everything was okay. Except that, despite my best efforts, he stubbornly remained unreassured, even after I'd unbuttoned my own shirt to demonstrate my own xiphisternum. So strong was the insistence and so high the level of anxiety, I even started to doubt myself. And I convinced myself that he might have developed a rapidly growing cancer that was the exact size, shape, and position of a normal xiphisternum. As my supervisor explained to me that day, anxiety is an infectious disease. Of course, since then I've diagnosed quite a few xiphisternums, and I don't get quite so alarmed, even in the face of the patient's insistence that it wasn't there yesterday. But over time, it started to dawn on me that the medicine I've been practicing for the past 10 years was probably having a minimal impact on the health of our nation. It seemed increasingly likely that the countless patients that I'd reassured and discharged from A&E had not been very reassured at all. Certainly, me poking them and prodding them, cannulating them and irradiating them, and telling them at 3 a.m. that I couldn't find anything wrong was not making them feel any healthier, and possibly for some was making them feel a whole lot worse. Now, it was about this time that life presented me with some different challenges. This is my son Barney, and tomorrow would have been his 5th birthday. Now, I'm not going to go into details about that today. Every single one of us has difficult and challenging periods in our lives. For me, the final result was a prolonged period of absence during my ST3 year. But I've come to be a great believer in the concept of post-traumatic growth and also cycles of growth. During that time off, I had quite a lot of therapy. And as a result, over the course of my GP training, I had a major shift in my worldview, both on a personal and a professional level. And I think in the role of a GP, I don't think we can separate those two, or at least I don't think we should try. And those experiences also taught me something about the process of learning something new. When we learn something new, it requires some destruction. We have to clear away the old ideas to give new ones the space to grow. But this necessary destruction is a painful process, because if we break down our belief systems, it's a frightening thing to do. We build those structures for a reason. They're there to guide and support and sustain us as we try to navigate through the world. And letting go of that map is a hard thing to do, because we might not feel certain that we'll ever be able to replace it. And that cycle of destruction and regrowth is represented in mythology by the phoenix, who is reborn from the flames. And I think this is a really important part of understanding the process of healing. And as part of that reframing I did, I started to realize that as a human being, I wasn't just a doctor, but I was also a patient. I realized that if I wanted to help other people, I had to help myself first. I know that sounds cliched, but cliches become cliches for a reason. They're repeated often because they're important and frequently true. And so I started trying to practice what I preach in earnest. Since starting my GP training, I've been picking up from colleagues loads of tips on signposting, which seem to be the go-to replacement for the now redundant adenosine. And I've built up a nice little list of things to signpost to: mindful and meditation, sleep hygiene, yoga, couch to 5K, and the psychological wellbeing service. But I didn't really have any idea what these were about. It had never occurred to me to give them a try. And to be fair, I'd never tried adenosine either. In my mind, it was something for patients, not for doctors. And although I presumably had some awareness of the fact previously, it also highlighted the converse. My patients were humans, and as such, basically just like me. And this had a major impact on my view of what the doctor and patient relationship was about. The key word for me is the word relationship. And relationships defined as a state of being connected. It's about kinship and oneness. And I wonder if the very terms doctor and patient might lead us in the wrong direction, because by defining these as separate roles, it creates a feeling of otherness, of us and them. And the key to therapeutic relationships really is about togetherness. So in addition to having a lot of time out, what had happened to me meant that I'd ended up living an hour's commute from my training practice. And previously, it had just literally been down the road. And when I returned to work, I'd still had my CSA, which is the main GP exam to sit. And I had this big commute. So I decided to use that time by listening to practice cases on YouTube. And before long, I started to really value that thinking time while I was driving. And for me, when I'm driving, it kind of affords a special kind of focus. And I think it's a bit like that unique feeling of sleeping in the car when you're a kid. And so after I passed the exam, I realized I was really missing that kind of focused thinking time. And for me, listening to the radio just wasn't cutting it. And so I discovered podcasts and started listening to those. And I absolutely loved it. And I find it a great way of learning new ideas. And since I could do it while I was driving, it was almost like it was free time. And on the screen, a few of my favorite podcasts. But initially, I was really heavily influenced by two in particular: Dr. Chatterjee's Feel Better, Live More, and Cara Lowenthal's very rudely titled podcast. And taken together, they had a really clear message. And the first was that our lifestyles are really the key determinant of our health. And the second is that our thoughts are the key to our lifestyles. So it doesn't take a genius to extrapolate from that our thoughts must be the key to our health. So after several years of being in a really dark place, I genuinely felt like I'd be reborn. Again, I know it sounds cliched, but I can't think of any other way of describing it. I'd rediscovered hope and connection and beauty when I'd thought that all was lost, and it felt incredible. And the tools I'd used to do it were by and large free. They were immediately available to everyone. You didn't need a prescription or referral or to sit for months on a waiting list. And so the penny had finally dropped regarding the importance of ideas, concerns, and expectations. The major determinants of our health is our lifestyle, but the determinants of our lifestyle are our thoughts and feelings, or in other words, our ICE. If our health is equally dependent on our physical bodies, on wider society, and our mental states, of these three, the one we seem to have the most power to influence is the last one. And so for me, this makes it an ideal therapeutic target. It's not so much about the doctor understanding the patient's ICE, but more about the doctor facilitating the patient in understanding and exploring their own ideas, concerns, and expectations. To consider for themselves which of these might be helpful and which are unhelpful. To think about if some of these beliefs could be part of the problem, holding them back or preventing them from finding helpful solutions. Our health beliefs are such powerful determinants of health, we really can't afford not to view them as therapeutic targets in their own right. At the same time, almost in parallel, I'd come to the conclusion that by and large, the stuff I'd learnt in medical school, the stuff that you do need a prescription for, was not the answer to the majority of the problems people were consulting me for, both mental and physical. Despite the omeprazole and sertraline prescriptions, people kept coming back because they didn't feel any better. And as anyone who grew up in the 90s knows, the drugs don't work. And also, fishermen's hats are cool. So understandably, I was fairly enthusiastic about all this. And it's impossible for our personal outlook to not impact the way we're consulting. So I started to share my findings with my patients, wanting to share these revelations far and wide. I'd frequently recommend podcast episodes and talk passionately about the power of meditation and mindfulness. I'd explain earnestly that our thoughts cause our feelings, not our circumstances, and that health could be found through a compassionate exploration of our psychological lives. And after this impassioned sermon, I'd review the patient in 4 weeks and find that they'd done absolutely none of it. Instead, they'd developed several new symptoms, done some research on the internet, and wondered about getting their Lyme serology checked. Strangely enough, worldview is not an easy therapeutic target. And it turns out that the therapeutic process of being reborn out of flames of destruction takes more than 10 minutes. So this was a rock and a hard place. The drugs don't work, but the alternative seemed unacceptable to the patient and undeliverable by the doctor. When I was consulting, I could sometimes feel like I could see stuck points or unhelpful patterns in people's thinking. I recognized them because I'd experienced them in myself. And through a difficult and painful process, I thought I'd acquire some knowledge or skills that might be able to help, which I desperately wanted to impart to them. But I had a sense that there was a closed door between us that prevented any learning. And more than this, people didn't want that door opened and would do everything they could to keep it closed. People simply didn't trust that I had something to say that might be relevant to them. And I think the result was dissatisfied patients and me left feeling powerless to help. Now, with my exams finally behind me, I started to experiment a little more with my consulting style. I started to adopt a much less formulaic approach. And I was also advancing through the Headspace app and was making a conscious effort to try and be present and in the moment in each and every consult. And in doing this, I started to experience an unusual phenomenon, almost an ability which, in my ignorance, I called seeing into people's souls. When people were telling me their stories, I sometimes felt I could really see them. I could feel them in a way that I'd rarely done before. And I found it hard to put into words because it was very experiential. I was in the moment and I was with them in a shared experience. Not only that, but when it happened, I could tell that they could feel it too. The patient somehow knew that I was seeing them. There was a powerful connection between us, and it was beautiful. And this, I think, is a somewhat spiritual experience, and I think it's what the ultra-spiritual types refer to as holding space for someone. And as you can imagine, this was somewhat unfamiliar to me. As a cynical A&E doctor, I would not have said I was very spiritually minded, and holding space for a patient predominantly meant stopping the paramedics putting another patient in their bed space while they're away in X-ray. And these consults, which frequently ended in tears, both mine and the patient's, felt incredibly powerful. And they seemed to have positive outcomes, sometimes triggering for the patient a similar personal journey that I'd been on, a new cycle of growth, the phoenix from the flames. And naturally, I was excited about this newfound skill, and I wanted to share the experience and explore what it meant with other GPs. And by this time, I'd qualified, and I happened to be doing some locum shifts at my old training practice. And so I discussed it one day with my old educational supervisor. And they seemed somewhat perplexed. And several days later, I received an email from the practice asking me to please refrain from looking into people's souls at their surgery. They felt it might be contrary to the GMC good medical practice and were concerned that patients may not have consented to having their souls looked at. And I was somewhat dismayed by this. After all, who doesn't want to be a good medical doctor? And as a result, I felt reluctant to discuss it further with colleagues, not wanting to alienate people while I was trying to establish myself as a newly qualified GP. But despite that, I continued to try and connect with people in my consults. I felt really certain that it wasn't a bad thing because the actual experience was so positive. And sometime later, I discussed it with my sister because families are somewhat safe space. My sister's a pediatrician and she runs an inpatient family therapy unit. And I one day tentatively asked her if she ever looked into her patient's souls. And she naturally replied, "Oh, you're talking about mentalization." And that was somewhat reassuring because it turns out that mentalization-based therapy is a clinically proven treatment modality and not just some spiritual woo-woo of the sort that the GMC is so highly suspicious. And so I went away and tried to learn as much as I could about mentalization. And I think more or less it is what I was experiencing, although I don't think it's so much about this as this. Now, this is my dog Tahuna. And the night before this photo was taken, she'd eaten our entire food supply for our wild camping trip while I was setting up the tent. And although I love showing people pictures of my dog, and when I do nursing home visits, it's pretty much all I do. On this occasion, there's a reason for it. Because in this picture, Tahuna is trying to mentalize me. Now, the term mentalization comes from the work of Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman, who are child and adolescent psychologists at the Anna Freud Centre in London. And they describe it as a way of being with. It's the process of being cognizant of your own and other people's behaviors based on an awareness of what they call intentional mental states. And intentional mental states is basically a fancy way of saying our beliefs and thoughts and feelings. It's not about knowing these, but rather just about being curious about it. And as such, it's described as an imaginative activity. And in this picture, you can imagine Tahuna's thinking, I wonder what's in your mind right now and why, and what might that mean for my chances of breakfast? She's trying to puzzle it out. And if you really look into her eyes, you can tell that she's doing it. You can feel it. And there's something kind of reassuring and comforting about it. So when we mentalize another person, we try and form a picture in our own minds of what might be going on in their mind. The cliche for this is putting yourself in their shoes, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And it's closely linked with ideas of empathy and compassion. But not only do we form this picture in our minds, but the other person sees that we have this picture. And through that, they feel that we get them, that we have really seen them, and understand a little bit about what it means to be them. A sense that you get me, you understand me. And through that process, we create epistemic trust, and this can open the door to learning. Now, epistemic trust is a long phrase, but it's really quite simple. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, and epistemic trust means that for me, I trust the knowledge that you have in your mind might be relevant to me. And mentalization is the key to this trust, because if you can accurately mentalize me, and I'm able to see that you get me, I'm likely to think, okay, now I'm interested. If you can do that, if you can get me and see me, what else have you got to offer? And these slides I have on the screen are taken from a lecture by Dickon Bevington, who's also from the Anna Freud Center. And I think he explains this much better than me. And if you're interested in these ideas, I'd really recommend checking out his videos on the YouTube channel, which is called Ambit TV. So by this time, I really felt like I was getting somewhere. Not only had I discovered the secret to life, health, and happiness, which wasn't really a secret, it's just that mostly we're not very good at listening. But I'd also discovered the secret of how to tell other people the secrets. And I started to get some success stories. Patients that I'd previously considered beyond help and fobbed off with some omeprazole, secretly hoping they'd consult with a different GP next time. Sometimes went away and read the book or listened to the podcast episode I'd suggested. And a few even felt better. My previous heart sync consults were rapidly becoming some of my favorites. But I still had a problem, because explaining the secret to life, health, and happiness is somewhat time-consuming. And of course, as GPs, we've forever got around this problem with signposting, and there was no shortage of material to signpost to. In fact, I kind of had the opposite problem. There was almost too much. And it's been well documented that if we have excessive choices, this has a negative impact on our productivity. There was kind of helpful snippets of information in multiple resources. And although there was loads of good resources, they were often not exactly what I needed. Like Feel Better, Live More is fantastic, but some of the episodes are over 2 hours long. And I started to realize I needed something a little bit more bespoke, a bit more personal, like a summary. The secret to life, health, and happiness, the Cliff Notes. And so I decided to write my own podcast. I recorded them in my living room, and I've published them on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. And I also created a website for the less tech savvy, and you can listen to the episodes directly on the website. Or if you're really old school, you can simply read the transcripts. And the concept was to create a structured program that could explore health beliefs and how these can impact on our actual health. It's primarily designed to be used like that and to be listened to in order, with homework set after each episode. But I do also recommend standalone episodes for certain patients. And for example, I've got episodes on feeling tired all the time, and some for sleep hygiene. There's one for depression and anxiety, and one for understanding the use of antidepressants. And what I hope is that signposting to myself makes things a little bit more personal and perhaps increases the likelihood of patients engaging. So it has the benefit of that personal touch, but with the time saving of a pre-recorded material. So far, I've released 23 episodes, and they're freely available on 12 different platforms. And the great thing about podcasting is that you get loads of feedback with statistics. And so far I've had over 4,000 plays, and it's been listened to in 34 different countries. My personal favorite is Brunei, and I like to think that the Sultan himself has been tuning in. You also get stats on the demographics, and so you can see here there's a fairly equal male to female split, but I do have a clear age preference with nearly 70% being between the ages of 28 and 44. Now, this is a little bit skewed because the platform that I use, the hosting platform I use, only collects this data from Spotify and not the other platforms. So it could reflect that more that older people are less likely to be using Spotify. I expect that the over 60s are much more likely to be accessing it on the website. As well as your individual statistics, you can also look up and see how your podcast is performing compared to others in its genre. And when I first discovered this feature, I was extremely excited to see that I was ranked at number 5, knocking Dr. Chatterjee off his top spot. But unfortunately, I soon realized that that was for Apple Podcasts in Peru, which is perhaps less useful. But since then, I have ranked in the UK, and I've been up to number 8 in the medicine category on Apple Podcasts. And apparently Dr. Alex, who you see there at number 6, is famous from being on Love Island. So it's kind of nice to be rubbing shoulders with the celebrities. And whilst these rankings are quite amusing, in reality, for me, the numbers are very small. And realistically, I don't expect much fame and fortune from the podcast. But that's not really why I wrote it. And predominantly, it's designed as a consulting tool for me to use in my own consults and with my own patients. And having the podcast available means that I often try and approach topics that I may previously have shied away from. You know, I just didn't want to scratch the surface because I felt like I had no tools to follow up with. And I think of that a bit like never wanting to take the leg dressings down when you're on a home visit. So I don't really like to blow my own trumpet, but this email that I received at the beginning of this year really highlights for me what the podcast is all about. And I want to just give you a moment to read it through for yourself because I think it demonstrates it better than I can. Now, the reason I particularly like this feedback is that I actually can't even remember this patient. So, as she says in her email, I'd met her once for a routine medication review. And it's very tempting and sometimes absolutely necessary to use these consults as a catch-up. A medication review for a 30-year-old on a single agent SSRI can be dealt with very quickly if we simply ask about any new side effects and then reissue for another year. And this can be especially tempting as a locum because there's a very good chance it's a patient that you've never met before and are likely to never meet again. And I'd be lying if I'd said I'd never done it and continue to do so on really busy days. But having the podcast available makes it much more likely that I'll attempt to mentalize, even if it's just for 10 minutes. I see the face-to-face consult as a catalyst or an enzyme. The purpose is to start a reaction, but the real work is done by the patients for themselves. The consult plants a seed, and the podcast is there to water it. Now, as a GP trainee, when I first came across Stott and Davis's exceptional potential for every primary care consult, it seemed like an unrealistic ambition to me. General practice just felt so time pressured, expectations and demands so high, that I barely felt I had the bandwidth to deal with the minimum requirements. But having my podcast available has completely moved the goalposts. And now, exceptional potential seems like a genuine possibility. So I promised some time for questions and discussion, so I think I'm just going to leave it there. As I said at the start, I'm fairly new to all of this, and it's very much a work in progress. And so I'd really welcome any thoughts and comments and see if we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, firstly, just wanted to say thank you for sharing your personal story and how that's led you on this journey. It was really good to hear about that. But also, I think it struck me that this is actually quite a simple idea, but it's obviously having, you know, a significant impact. And you can see that in the sort of statistics you presented in terms of having had 4,000 plays and being listened to in 34 different countries. And I particularly liked what you said there at the end about how the consultation is about planting the seed, and then the podcast is there to water it. I'm sure that the group have got loads of questions for you, because this is, I think, a really interesting topic, and I think it's probably touched on a lot of us who struggle with these similar issues day in and day out with the 10-minute consultation, and not really feeling like we're maybe doing our job as well as we could be a lot of the time. So I'm interested to hear from others in the group and to capture more questions. So I'll open it to the floor now.
I've got a question. Thanks, Will, for sharing your story. I've been doing, I think, a similar thing to you, and trying to share them. And it's sort of, for me, it's a bit hit and miss. So you get some people who never come back, and I have no idea what happened to them or whether it did work for them. There've been a couple who thought that was really good, that thing you recommended. My sort of worry is about reaching the unreachables. The inverse care thing, it's complete nightmare, because there's clearly some people who really do need help with, for example, sleep and just trying to have some part stability in their life, but they often don't come to see us, or when they do come, it's very fleeting, and you try and make follow-up, and it's really difficult. I wondered if you had any thoughts about sort of reaching the unreachables, about the technological divide, which obviously is happening now as sort of general practice, and a lot of healthcare is being online to help with the pandemic. And if you had any ideas around that.
Yeah, so I think I know exactly what you're talking about. So you just feel like you're really not going to get through to people. And for me, it's the mentalization. It really is. So it's about being able to connect with people in that time that you have, and to create that epistemic trust. And like, the truth is, like, you can't do it every time. It's not like you can always do that for every patient. And actually, like, for me, I think it's understanding what I can do and what I can't. So like, by definition, you can't reach the unreachable because they're unreachable. But what you can do is you can try to mentalize everybody, even if you think it's not going to happen. And like, I had some surprising things. So sometimes, like, because I don't like getting 1-star reviews on Apple, like I don't recommend it to everybody, you know, because there's some people that this kind of approach is not going to work for. But what I do is I won't necessarily recommend the podcast every time, but I do try to mentalize every time. And like, sometimes I've been really surprised. So there's people I've thought, from the way they've given their opening story, I thought there's no way that, you know, we're just so far apart. There's no way they're going to be interested in thinking about the mind-body connection, or like a different way of understanding health. But I still try and mentalize. And I have had times when people actually have gone away and listened to the podcast when I really thought they wouldn't. So I guess for me, it's just about that, just trying, really. But I think you have to accept that you're not going to win them all. And some people, you know, you're going to, like, they're just not going to engage with it. And then all you can do is try again the next time, I think.
Thank you.
I've got a question. I can't seem to put my hand up on this Zoom. I don't know if it's something wrong with my Zoom, but so I don't want to butt in if someone else is already waiting to ask.
Okay, just go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Will. That was really lovely to listen to, and really interesting. I'm wondering whether you've noticed, have you got any tips? And you know, when we're faced with someone that we know that there's something that this is so much deeper than what they've presented with, and you have a sense that if they were to be able to think beyond that to the wider aspects of their life, that you might get somewhere in the long term. I see it as a kind of like a motivation interviewing. How do you move them onto that next state where they might actually be pre-contemplative about there being a different way of viewing it? Whether you've got any tips to to nudge people along in that direction?
Yeah, so I think it's the same thing again. So what I do is I really try and, so it came from doing Headspace and from that kind of mindfulness. So I really try and listen in the moment to what people are saying. Now it sounds like really cliched, but I don't know, it's weird. And I try to get that connection so that they feel like, so I think people feel, if they feel like you've seen them, then they're more likely to listen to the things that you recommend. So then I would really just listen for the first kind of period and try and feel what they're feeling. I actually try and feel what they're feeling. And then when that happens, like, I don't know, like once I feel like they see that they can feel that I'm hearing them, then I will try and say things that may not be what they expect to hear, you know? Because sometimes we'd be reluctant to say things that we think people don't want to hear. So for example, like saying to somebody that like they need to take responsibility for aspects of their own health. Now, that can be a difficult thing to say to somebody. But what I found is that you can, if people really believe that you genuinely have their best interests at heart, you can get away with saying things that you normally wouldn't say. So for example, I remember when I was training, I had a patient that I said to him, look, I think you need to not be a dick. And I told my supervisor about it. He's like, I can't believe you said that. But actually, it doesn't really, you can say anything you want if people really believe you're trying to help them. So I think that's, I don't know if that really entirely answers what you're saying, but for me, that's what I try and do. Like, it doesn't always work. Sometimes I get complaints, as you can imagine. Because if you have to be prepared to be uncomfortable, and you have to be prepared to say things that people don't want to hear. But you have to say it from a place where you genuinely really want to help them, and you genuinely feel like you are in it together, like the two of you are in it together.
Thanks.
Thanks, Will. I think Tamar's got a similar question, but slightly different. She's asked about resources to develop skills in mentalization. Are you aware of any?
So the Anna Freud Center has this thing called Ambit, which is, they called it a Tiddly manual. So it's an online web page that you can make local versions of. And the idea is to use the concepts of mentalization within teams. So the idea is that so they say, if you're an organization that's working with vulnerable people or hard to reach people, your patient facing time is only a quarter of your role. And the other parts of that is your wider community, your smaller team, and your kind of QI, basically. And it's talking about using the concepts of mentalization, not just with working with your patients, but with working with each other. And there's loads and loads of resources on that manual for what mentalization is all about, how we do it. On their YouTube channel, which goes along with it, which is called Ambit TV, there's lots of examples of mentalization, examples of when we don't mentalize and what happens. And I think that, like, for me, I think that's a really useful resource. And I've been thinking about trying to set up a local Tiddly manual. So I'm the first 5 lead in Cambridgeshire. And I've been thinking about trying to set up a Tiddly manual for first 5 GPs to explore how we can use this work when working collaboratively with each other and also with our patients. So I'd really recommend checking that Ambit out.
I've got a question for you. How long did it take you to develop and create the podcasts?
Ages.
Was it a lot of work?
It takes ages. Yeah. Because so normally I write the episode and then like I edit it all, and then you record it, and then you got to edit the recording, and like it's a lot of time. And actually, I haven't, since COVID, I've actually not released an episode because you need quite a lot of bandwidth for it. And I think with everything that's been going on with Corona, I've got 4 new episodes ready to record, but I just haven't got around to it. So you do need a bit of space. And so for me, that's why I've been locuming, because it's given me that, I have that little bit more control over my time. And so like I might not take a shift for a week so I can get an episode out. But it does take time. But I'm happy for you to use mine if you want.
And can I also ask what you think about social prescribing? because I guess in many ways, actually, social prescribing is probably trying to fill this gap, as in it's trying to address some of the underlying problems, but it means that we then defer to somebody else. It's not signposting back to ourselves, like you say, which you feel is more effective. So it would be good to get your thoughts on that as well.
So I think social prescribing is fantastic. Like, I think it's exactly what medicine's all about for me, actually. But I think that the problem is that you can't offer someone something that they're not interested in. So you have to change what people are interested in. If you think that what they need to engage with to get better isn't what they think they need to engage with. And so that's where, so there's a slightly different level that you're working at. So I think, you have to have the resources there, because if you've said to someone, why don't you thinking about your health a little bit differently, maybe it's not entirely to do with what's going on in your back. Maybe it could be related to other things that's going on socially, or whatever it is, But if there's nothing that they can then engage with, then it's useless. So sometimes I'll talk to people about this stuff, and they'll say, okay, like I see what you're saying, like I understand that pain can be more complex than just what's going on in the tissues, but what am I going to do about it? And that's where the social prescribers come in, because you have to have those resources available. So actually people can go to a meditation and mindfulness class, and people can go and have some acupuncture, and people do have groups that are available that they can engage with. So like for me, like social prescribing sits exactly alongside it, and I think it's a fantastic thing. And like some of the social prescribers I've worked with locally are really fun. It's a new role, but they're really quite fantastic.
Okay, great, thanks, Will. Any other questions?
There's a question from Ben.
Go, Ben.
Hi, for sharing your experience. Powerful. Just wondering if you guessed it on anybody else's podcast.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
I think Ben asked if you've been a guest on anyone else's podcast.
Oh, so I'm not that famous yet, unfortunately. I was actually, I had a patient that asked me to be a guest on a podcast that they were writing. I did actually meet with her, but she never released it. So no is the answer.
So
maybe in like another few years, I can be on Feel Better, Live More.
well, the reason I ask, I'm not a GP, in fact, not even a Q. I'm a digital communications manager. I work for an integrated care system. So one of the things we do is we run podcasts for anyone who works in health and care in the area that I work in, which is West Yorkshire and Harrogate. And we try to use quite a collaborative approach to the way we do our podcast. And we have had a few GPs on. Our podcast mainly have been about either mental health or diversity issues. But it's something that I would recommend, being more of a podcaster than a health professional. It's something that you might want to look into. You mentioned social prescribing, for example. There might be mental health groups or even social prescribing groups associated with either your local CCG or your integrated care system there that run things and that would love to have you, involved. So it might be worth getting in touch with your local CCG comms team or even your integrated care system comms team, see if there's any opportunities for you there to lend your voice, because I'm sure other people would love to hear your story and your insights.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Anyone else would like to come in? I'm going to wrap up by asking you a question then, Will, in terms of what your ambition is for this and how you would like to take things forward. And also, is there anything that the Q community can do to help you?
Yes, I guess what I'd really like to do is to develop it further so that it can be used as a structured program, so that you could have a dedicated primary care service for the types of patient that I think this would be most useful for. So it's kind of things like functional symptoms and kind of mental health issues and complex kind of physical and mental health interactions. And so the ideal would be to get a service commissioned where people could be referred in to see GPs that are using the podcast alongside face-to-face consults to deliver a structured program similar to what the psychological wellbeing service would offer. So you could come for, say, 6 sessions where we essentially explore health beliefs using the podcast to maximize the clinician input. So that's really what I'd like to try and do. I did actually put in a Q Exchange proposal for getting some funding to run a pilot, but unfortunately it wasn't shortlisted. But I think, you know, in terms of the Q, I joined the Q community really to kind of network with other people that think about similar things, like as Ben says, like other people in healthcare that are thinking about this way of thinking about how we can impact people, and to kind of get new ideas, and anyone that's kind of doing similar work, and also really think about like what the like I've been developing the podcast very much independently, and I'd love like other GPs to give me some feedback to say, you know, I think this was helpful or this wasn't, or do you think it'd be useful to have episodes about particular topics? So, you know, that kind of thing would be really, really helpful for me.
Great, thanks, Will. That's yeah, it sounds like you're on an exciting journey. I'm sure we'd all like to be a part of it. What I'd say is do post in the group as well, you know, regarding podcasting for health, and sharing some of the resources, as well as the things around the AMBIT group that you mentioned. I can see from the chat that you know, everyone's felt that it's been a really thought-provoking talk, and they're really grateful for your time today, and so am I. So thank you. Is there anything you'd like to say, Will, to wrap up?
I'd just like to thank everyone for coming along. I know it's been a really hectic time in primary care over the last few months, and so I think it's great to see so many people like giving up their lunchtime to come and hear what I have to say. And I guess I hope that people can think about if they could incorporate this into their own practice, or if there's anything that's kind of useful to think about. So, and Ramya, thank you so much for organising these sessions. I think they're great.
Well, that's good to hear, Will. In terms of next events, so we've had, this is the 3rd, so we've covered things around flu-based, hub-based flu clinics, drive-through childhood immunisations, matching capacity and demand in general practice, now podcasting for health. I thought we could take a bit of a break next month, so not have a lunchtime webinar as such, but maybe use the time to do something like randomized coffee trials. So I'm sure some of you will be very familiar with the concept of them, but essentially it's a chance to meet and network with other people in the group. I think we're from all over the country and from further afield, working in different areas. There's a real kind of diversity in the group. And I've been involved in the randomized coffee trials at the Q conference earlier this year, and I found it actually really refreshing, particularly in the current climate where we're not meeting people and not having those networking opportunities in the same way. So I think it would actually be quite a nice time to do this. So I'm going to post something within the Q primary care special interest group around that. Essentially, it will just be a Google form where you can put in some basic details and say what you'd like to get out of the session, and I'll put you in touch with maybe 1 or 2 other people who you can then connect with. And it would be good if people could then feedback around their discussions on the group as well, so we can capture the learning. Great. I think we've done well to keep to time today. So I'm going to let everybody go and get on with the rest of their day. And thank you again for joining.